Hello, and welcome to the Conspiracy Farm. This is your host, Vincent LeCornu. That's how we say it in America. The original French name is LeCornu, and we'll talk more about what that means and where the name came from in future episodes. But the first thing I want to do before I get into today's subject is just talk a little bit about who the heck am I and why am I doing this and why would anybody care? Basically, I'm a country guy. I grew up in rural East Texas. We were 8 miles from the nearest gas station. And when we first moved there, we were like 30 miles from the nearest McDonald's. And when you're growing up out in what is a drained rice field, sometimes there's not a whole lot to do. We had, as older people will recall, we had 6 TV channels, no internet. We didn't have a VCR until I was 10. And, we weren't poor. My grandfather kept us up to date on technology. So when we got our VCR, that was about when everybody else got theirs. And I got a nice, shiny Apple IIc in 1985, which was considered top of the line. So I spent a lot of time as a kid in this weird combination of being very outdoorsy and exploring nature, but then also trying out my basic programming and reading the latest science fiction books. So I watched a lot of movies and read a lot of books growing up, maybe too many. I was a little too young to have experienced seeing Star Wars for the first time in 1977. Too young, don't remember it at all. The movie I do remember seeing came out a little bit later. That was Raiders of the Lost Ark. That movie, I think, changed my perceptions about what I wanted to do with my life. Here's a guy who, he's a professor. He knows the Bible backwards and forwards. He knows all these dead languages, but he also has girlfriends all over the world. He travels around. He punches bad guys. He can wear a leather jacket and a fedora. He can ride a horse. He can do all this stuff. And that was something I wanted to experience because I was obsessed with the idea that, what did these ancient people know? That scene where Indiana Jones dusts off the stone carvings in that one map room, and he's able to just run his fingers across the inscribed hieroglyphics, and he's able to connect with someone who wrote that down or carved that in stone thousands of years ago. I thought that was the coolest thing in the world, and he's good with a gun. I mean, come on, can't do better than that. So that stuck with me because later I got my academic scholarship. I came to UT and I was studying Asian studies and business. I was going to do all kinds of these other things. And then I went into film and studied that. And then I had to take some sort of fine arts history course, that kind of thing. And I made the mistake and I booked this classical civilization course about ancient Greek history. And I remembered, I was interested in all that stuff. I remember Indiana Jones. Well, that opened a whole Pandora's box of issues for me. And so I started rereading things and I got back into it. And I decided to go ahead and finish my degree in classical civ. So I got my degree in classical civ, but then I didn't do anything with it. I got a boring job in Austin and got married, had some kids, and the rest is history until now. Between coming to UT and this day, I have had a lot of strange jobs and interests, and a lot of my podcast episodes will be about those episodes. For years, I edited scientific papers and novels before sending them to publications. I did professional fashion photography. That was a strange one. I've always been into martial arts, so Taekwondo, boxing, Krav Maga has always been a thing of mine, and I adapted that to make money in private security. Written some screenplays, parts of screenplays and novels. I wrote 400 pages of a novel, and I can't even find it now because it was terrible. One of these days I'll restart with the same characters. I started a cult. We'll talk about that. It was a scientific cult, though. It was good. It was supposed to be for positive political action. That was years and years and years ago. I don't know that there is such thing as positive political action anymore, but that's another subject. So, been a lifelong intellectual, fascinated with history and languages. I guess I should also mention that because of my constant changing majors, I did end up taking years of Japanese and Chinese and ancient Greek and Latin. So what is this podcast? Well, what is this about? Well, I think I just had some ideas that I think people would find interesting, especially because as I've grown older, I have met more people. I've tried my hand at a lot of things, and I'm starting to find out that the world is much more complicated than we think, and it might be more complicated than humans are actually capable of dealing with. And I've also spent my youth being so certain of all the knowledge that I've stacked up over the years. All those books I read in the swamp, oh gosh, I knew my Plato. I know all the logical problems with Descartes and that sort of thing. Well, and, of course, I was the militant atheists all through the 2000s and whatnot. I was actually in certain groups involved in that. And yeah, the strangest thing is that I found out that I generally don't get along with strident atheists. So my best friends all through my life have been very spiritual people or religious people. It tends to be where I'm more comfortable, although clearly I can deal with having friends that have vastly different opinions than me on certain issues. But as I've gotten older and I've become more skeptical of the things I learned in the past, and especially after some of the revelations that have come out in the last 20 years about what the government may have done or known about certain things, as I've gotten older and more jaded, I've started to build up more doubts about things, and I've come to re-examine certain things in my life and my Gen X old age here. And it's odd. You spend a life being skeptical of so many things, and you find yourself later on in life realizing, well, you don't know everything. And I had a thought a few years ago. What if almost everything people have reported throughout history has been true? What if it was their genuine experience? It may not have literally happened molecularly the way they said, but it was something they perceived. And so what if all the mythologies, these old stories, they really did happen in some sense? And so for the first podcast of the Conspiracy Farm, I thought maybe since we're starting after Easter, it would be fitting to talk about, one of the figures that crops up in almost every conspiracy theory, Jesus Christ, Jesus of Nazareth. He has different names. We're going to do a podcast eventually just about Jesus's name. How do we end up with Jesus, which doesn't sound anything like Yeshua. If you watch The Passion of the Christ, you'll never hear anyone refer to him with the name Jesus, not even Pilate. So we're going to talk a little bit about my thoughts on Jesus and, what I've learned about the subject. And so is everybody ready? We're ready to start overthinking issues. That's my brand. That's what I tend to do. I wanted to call this episode the J word, because it's almost like a trigger warning, because it is similar to, say the N word, because the word Jesus, it triggers people. And it's interesting. And I think it's because everybody has their own personal version of Jesus. That Depeche Mode was right. Everybody has their own conception of what Jesus is, who he is, what he's like. And they normally develop that at birth. It has huge effects on their life. And so anytime somebody says, I'm going to start talking about Jesus, people start to cringe because they think, well, oh gosh, he's going to unload his conception of Jesus on me. Let's just get this over with. Well, that's not what I'm here to do. My relationship with the subject is long and complex. I grew up religious. In my household growing up, God was part of everyday conversations. It wasn't just this thing we talked about on Sunday. We watched not only the Ten Commandments, but I remember a production that I believe was from 1978, Jesus of Nazareth by Franco Zeffirelli, who is a devout Catholic filmmaker in the 70s, and that it was a miniseries, and it aired on NBC. We watched that every Easter, and I memorized those lines. And Robert Powell, the man who played Jesus in that miniseries, I thought he's one of the best ones. And obviously, he's a British actor, pale skin, blue eyes, and so he may not look the part historically. Mel Gibson, I think, did more, I guess, historically accurate casting, but once again, you know, does Jesus's actual skin tone, is that the most important thing to convey on screen? You know, I think Robert Powell did a great job of getting at what must Jesus have been like in person. And it was intense and interesting. One thing the actor did to prepare was he said that when the director yelled action, he wouldn't blink. That Jesus, if you watch that entire miniseries, Jesus never blinks when he talks to people. Anyway, phase 2 of my religious upbringing was studying the Bible in school. And so when I switched to classics, you know, you have to learn Greek. And your first year of Greek is, you know, basic Greek, and they start you with Attic Greek, Attic. It's basically the Athenian dialect. It's what Plato wrote in, Thucydides, and to some extent Aristotle, more or less. And then the second year they jerk you around and they make you learn Homeric Greek. The difference between Homeric Greek and Attic Greek is similar to Shakespearean English and modern English. So, of course, you had to relearn pronunciations, and the grammar was old and strange. Then they jerk you around one more time, and your third year has to be Koine Greek, which is the dialect that the New Testament was written in, and a lot of later Greek writers wrote in. And it's sort of a derivation on Attic Greek. So it's relatively easy, but still complex. And a lot of the classes in your third year Greek you spend with at the seminary buildings, studying, and with people who are practicing to, we're going to go into, religious occupations. So that creates an interesting social dynamic. But of course, this was during the time when I started becoming more skeptical of the subject. We'll talk about my archaeology in a later podcast, because I did some archaeology projects one summer in Italy, and we were one Saturday we were at the site where they shot most of the Passion of the Christ. It was the stand-in for Jerusalem pre-70 AD, before the Romans destroyed it. We'll talk about that later. But now we'll go into phase 3. Now, phase 3 is where I am now. I think the best way to sum it up would be that I'm turning 50 years old this year, and I've always thought that I was a pretty clever human. And I'm starting to really embrace my intellectual limitations. And so I'm thinking, well, gosh, if I'm one of the humans that worked pretty hard at this, and I haven't gotten much anywhere in terms of, really nailing down moral philosophy and figuring out what humans should be doing for the next 20 years to save the world and whatnot. I'm starting to think maybe humans in general are just too stupid to have really clear, certain opinions on certain subjects. And maybe this is one of them. I've started switching from questions like, is Muhammad's conception of God scientifically accurate, to questions like, what is it? What's a good working definition for God, period? What does that word even mean? Because there's so many meaningless definitions. You can come up with a definition for God in 5 seconds that adds nothing to your life. And now I've gone from what was Jesus's genome like, to questions like, well, what does it mean that we had this person, or something more than a person, that was here on earth and said these things and did these things? What does that mean? And so that's more of what I just wanted to talk about today, just to start the discussion about Jesus, because we always go into who has the right set of facts and who doesn't. I find it fascinating that there are two elements of Jesus's character that people tend to focus on, and fittingly, I'll use the Greek terms. There's Jesus's ousia. You would transliterate that as Ousia. And then there's another Greek word that I know a lot of people have heard, his logos, Logos. Now, if you've been interested in, if you followed Christianity at all, these words probably won't be unfamiliar to you. Constantine was certainly very interested in Jesus's ousia. And ousia just means his nature, his isness. What is he made of? It's when, that's why in the Batman movies, they always have someone, when Batman grabs the bad guy for the first time, in Batman Begins or in the Michael Keaton Batman. I noticed that screenwriters never have them ask, well, who are you? They'll tend to say, what are you? And I think the ousia question is more related to, what are you? We've got, and we'll do podcasts about this, people who suggest, oh, well, whoever Jesus was, what if he was some sort of contactee or an experiencer, someone who had some relationship with extraterrestrial intelligence, NHI, with whatever these odd, non-human powers that be living here on Earth are. What if he had contact with those? And then you have people who look at, well, what kind of ideas may Jesus have picked up from Hinduism or Buddhism, which predates Christianity? Did he, or the Persian religions, did he bring those into Judaism? And is that where the change came from? Well, focusing on that would be focusing more on his logos. Now, logos, that Greek word is the root of, it comes from the same Greek word where we get ology from, like bios. Bios in Greek is life. And so biologia would be an accounting of life or a rational description of life. And so logos is a hard word to translate, but a lot of people have called it an accounting of or a rational description of. And logos usually involves words and ideas. So Jesus's ousia had to do with him being, born of a virgin, or, Jesus, he was a hybrid alien or something like that. These questions about, where does Jesus fit into the Trinity? How much of God the Father is in Jesus? These are questions, obviously, that in Constantine's day they were having to wrestle with. And those are questions over Jesus's ousia. And that's not something that I'll be addressing here. We'll be addressing his logos, and his logos has to do with, what did he say? What did he say his purpose was? What were some of his ideas? And this is where it gets interesting, because Jesus was successful at doing what he wanted to do, because he said he wanted to be divisive, and he said that he wanted to stubbornly remain in the realm of person-on-person discussion. People make a lot of, the Beatitudes and the sermon, Jesus's sermons where he's speaking to groups of people, but there aren't a whole lot of those. So many of the parables and the important things Jesus says, when you look at the context, he's saying it in someone's bedroom to two people. He's not saying it on a mountain, shouting it at a crowd. Jesus seems to not have liked crowds much. And maybe for good reason. Bad things tended to happen during the few times he was in front of a crowd. I'm thinking the incident at the temple with the money changers. So I think, of course, obviously, it's important for us to eventually investigate whether we think a person bodily returned, from the dead to greet former followers and to, exhort them into spreading the message to the future, to the rest of the world. And of course, it matters whether was Jesus literally biologically different from other humans in some way. I mean, obviously that's important, but I think a lot of people tend to ignore, well, what did Jesus have to say? In other words, it's important to address Jesus the way people all throughout Western civilization have thought about Socrates, for example. Socrates never wrote anything down as far as we can tell. there has been a tradition or an idea that Plato may have just made Socrates up. And even the account of his trial and execution, which I think is a little extreme. Socrates does not seem to be a made up person. However, the important thing is that it doesn't matter whether he was made up, because what Socrates talked about was important whether he was fictional or not. In other words, what was important about Socrates was a new way of thinking about truth, and about getting at the truth, and questioning people, and his attitude about knowledge. That's what was important, and what got copied later on. With Jesus, there's some element of that too. And Thomas Jefferson and other writers pointed this out, that there's an importance in Jesus, in how Jesus thought, and the kind of God that Jesus was describing. And this would be important regardless of what Jesus's actual nature is. And so, I suppose that's a good introduction for what I think about Jesus. I guess I'll conclude by just talking about an incident that I think underlines the importance of thinking about Jesus in his original context, and what he actually had to say. And a good example of that would be a story that I hear people talk about from the New Testament, where Jesus talks about, he says that it is easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than it is for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God. And so people have obviously in our world have a lot of thoughts about that. And I think that's a good one to mention first, because it shows the cultural gulf between the modern world and antiquity. Because when Jesus says a rich man in the 1st century AD in what's now Jerusalem, we're thinking someone like Elon Musk, or that one guy everybody knows who had a couple of $1 million in the bank by 40, because he was no fun in his 20s and was constantly trying out one business venture after another, and was very careful with his spending. Jesus was not talking about those people, because those people didn't really exist. Jesus was talking more, well, all right, now I got to say, this is my opinion. This is just, Jesus was making a cultural point. He was not saying that having a lot of wealth and comfort can drive you away from God. I think, once again, Jesus was talking to specific people. When you go back and you look at the incident, Jesus had just given a sermon, and a wealthy man came up to Jesus. And by the way, back then, it would have been obvious, based on how he dressed and how he talked, that he was of a different social class. This was not a fluid capitalist system. It's a very fixed, cruel agrarian system, where when you say someone is rich, that means they don't work. And if you see someone doing physical labor, then you know that they are not rich and will never be rich. Now, that's not the way we think of money now. Luckily, I like that we have some, we allow for some fluidity, and but I think we would all agree with ancient people. They had this idea that very wealthy people automatically become degenerate and weak, because humans are not designed to have more than a certain amount of comfort or stability or power that degrades people over time. And so the rich person came to Jesus and said, more or less, I really admire, what you had to say, and, what can I do to follow you? And Jesus said, if you would be perfect, that's important. If you would be perfect, then give away everything you have to the poor and come follow me. And the man looked dejected, because he wasn't willing to do that, and he left. And so Jesus turns to the disciples at that point and says, aha, see? And this is when says what he says about the rich man. So he's talking about this one specific guy. Once again, the interpersonal and contextual nature of Jesus comes out. And notice he said, if you would be perfect. So Jesus didn't say that if you want to be godly, give away everything you have to the poor and come follow me. He said that is a step that can be taken, but it's not necessary. And I think Jesus was making a statement about what the King James translators called the powers that be. Because one thing to remember about the time period that Jesus arrived on earth, it was an awful time. It was, the Romans had, there were only two kinds of people in the world back then, sheep and wolves. And the poor conquered people, they worked their fingers to the bone, literally in some cases, for the wealthy people that came and took their share for doing literally nothing. The entire Roman Empire was described by one historian as a pyramid scheme, an extortion operation. And, it's sort of like, yeah, that's a nice kingdom you have there. It'd be ashamed if something were to happen to it. That's essentially the Roman method of building empires. I suppose we could end it there in terms of talking about Jesus. We have a lot to talk about, whether Jesus knew Greek. We're going to do a whole podcast about Jesus speaking Greek in the New Testament, and then the Aramaic words that crept into the New Testament, and why did these Greek-speaking writers decide sometimes to go ahead and write the Aramaic word? And there are a couple of times where Jesus is quoted in Aramaic, not in Greek. And so that's important. What does that mean? So we, of course, are going to do the different hypotheses for Jesus. What do I think of the evidence for the different ones? I think there's the cosmic Jesus, the contactee, the experiencer, someone who had some sort of almost technological connection to the larger world. Then there's the gentle mystic Jesus, and here's where we look for influences of Hinduism, Buddhism, and this is a very human Jesus that doesn't have these scientifically cosmic connections. Then we have what a lot of scholars tend to settle on, which is what I call the radical rabbi. This was a religious leader from the same group that John the Baptist was from. They were radical monastic Jews who sought to get power from God in order to throw off the oppressors of Jews. And so this view sees Jesus as a political Jew using Greco-Roman methods, the parables and other teaching methods Jesus used to further the cultural goals of his branch of Judaism. So we'll talk about that. We'll talk about these different ones. We'll look at more about what Jesus actually had to say and why the Romans had problems with that. But that won't be our next podcast because this isn't a fully religious podcast. Obviously, we're going to talk about religion. I'm thinking we ought to branch out and just jump right into some alien stuff soon. So look out for that. We're going to be all over the place, and hopefully it'll stay interesting. But hopefully I haven't overthought the issue. Once again, like I said, this podcast is about overthinking, maybe looking a little too much into the details, or maybe looking too big picture. Like I said, I don't think humans are really up to the task of understanding the universe. I think we need help, and maybe we can help each other. You can help me. So let me know what you think, and I will see you guys next time.